So actually among these frequent VR users, we found out that roughly 80% believed that they would have experiences that would be indistinguishable from physical reality in only 3 years' time. And that to many is kind of ridiculous. But actually to others, to them it made sense, and I can sympathize with that because I'm using VR quite a lot recently, partly due to the projects we're doing in ConsumerLab. And one experience I had that was quite interesting was that I used to be a table tennis player, and one day we have two Vives in my home, two setups of these sort of more advanced VR environments. And one day, a friend of mine who also used to be a table tennis player came over. He is not into technology at all. He's my age. He hardly knows how to use a mobile phone. But he beat me in VR table tennis the first time he tried. Because he just played table tennis, just like he did normal table tennis. And that's how close. It's not indistinguishable, but it's comparable, actually. And that's what we found in this research. And of course, then a lot of these people also wanted to have more than just a view of this virtual world. So using, for example, if you play table tennis, you need your hand and a racket, so to speak, in VR. And if you want to play soccer or football, we say these days, I think soccer is the American expression, right? Then you also want to have your feet so you can kick that ball or whatever you're going to do in VR. So in order to interact with virtual objects, that was the starting point. And we said, hey, this is a really interesting field. We need to do a more extensive study, and that's what I'm going to present to you today. But the general idea is that the merging of your physical experience with some of these new technologies is what we mean by merged reality. There's no technology that we are pointing to with this. This is the experience from the consumer, okay? And so what we did then was that we did actually world first. We did qualitative research inside of VR, which was quite fun. We thought, well, let's eat our own dog food here and actually do the work. If we're going to meet VR users, let's meet them inside of virtual reality. I'll come back to that a little bit. We also did lag tests because we realized that if you are moving your head and the world kind of doesn't move with you, we were feeling a bit nauseous, so we needed to find out, you know, how big is this phenomenon. So we set up a test environment there where we actually introduced lag and actually tried to make people sick. We didn't do that on general people respondents. That was only done on Ericsson employees, so they had to sort of sign off that this was okay for them, just so you know, we're not trying to make people sick. And then we did also quantitative research where we tried to then sort of qualify what we had found out in this sort of early phase where we were more interacting with people. And we interviewed 9,200 people aged 15 to 69 in a number of different countries. And in these 8 countries where we went and did this research, there's about 800 million people living. But we say that the results here are not representative of all of those people. So if you want to talk statistical representativity, maybe 50 million or so. That's how sort of small this sample is in relation to people living in these countries in these age groups then. So of course this is a sort of narrowly focused study. What did we... Sorry?
51 million is narrow.
Well, if you normally say that you represent the views of 1 billion people, 50 million is kind of narrow, or 51 million. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just trying to tell you, maybe maybe this is still, we try to make the statistics as closely to what we believe as possible. Maybe we're still actually even more narrow, that's okay. What we're trying to say here is that we're not representing the views of everyone, but people who are aware of VR. Not all of these are using VR, but this was sort of the scope of people who said that they heard of the concept of VR or AR. If you think about Pokemon Go, that's an AR application. Some people who are using that actually knew that this was called AR as well, and then they would be included in this sample, so to speak. So yeah, it's narrow from a certain perspective, but it's a lot of people. Yeah, we only interviewed 9,200, so that's even more narrow. Yeah. Any question about the background before we go into talking about the study, by the way? It's okay? Yeah. So, what we found out then was that with this idea of sort of merging and blurring borders between virtual, augmented and physical realities, this will impact a lot of different areas of everyday life. And more specifically, what we found out was that these 6 areas, media consumption, education, work, social interaction, tourism and retail, were the 6 areas that most people, both actually in the qualitative phase, where we sort of had people talk about this, and when we then went out and tried to quantify this, these were the 6 areas that most people believed would be fundamentally changed when these technologies over time become more mass market. And so about 70% in the quantitative phase said that these were the 6 areas they believed would be fundamentally changed. And so how is this going to happen then? Well, obviously on the first level of things, what is going to happen is that VR, for example, will to a certain degree replace physical spaces. When we did this study, by the way, the new Apple iOS platform with ARKit and also the new Google platform with AR Core was not on the market. So a lot of the actual experience beyond Pokemon Go that we could actually sort of research around was more VR oriented. We did talk about AR a lot as well with these consumers, but basically their experience was either Pokemon Go, and we thought that was not enough. So then it was also VR background. But so people say, well, you know, first of all, of course, these physical spaces will be replaced. So offices, movie theaters, classrooms, showrooms. If you think about going to look at a new car or something like that, that's a showroom rather than a sort of a. And then you have mega stores or large shopping centers or whatever. These kind of areas. And of course, then there's some kind of devices that will be potentially replaced as well. So different kinds of screens, potentially smartphone screens and laptop and PC screens as well. And those who were already then users, frequent users of VR, they had, as you can see, across the whole board, more of those thought that this would happen. This was something that was actually going to happen than people who were then, those who were planning to use a headset among these, a VR headset among these people that we interviewed. And then, of course, those who were just aware of the concept, they had even slightly lower levels of this. And the first area of these 6 that would be affected, and is actually already affected, and we could see in the study, is media consumption. And if you think about it, it's quite interesting because this was exactly what happened when the internet got mainstream as well. So media consumption was the first, media was the first industry. Music, how many here using Spotify, for example? I mean, this was kind of music and movies and these kinds of things. Netflix, anyone, for example? Yeah, but you know the idea. We left the physical media and started using these kinds of things. So this was the first industry that was very much affected by the internet itself. And now we can see similar things happening with VR. And what we saw here then, that since they had started using VR, half of the respondents in the study, they said that they continued increasing their use of video watching inside of VR. And this was actually very much on short clips. It wasn't sort of the full movie experience, like the Hobbit trilogy or something in VR. That would make me sick, I think, as well, actually, if I think about it. But actually, a quarter of these people believe that within a year, they would actually be watching movies on virtual screens. And there are many applications available for that now in these VR environments. But it wasn't just about this sort of passive couch potato experience, but in a new sort of tech environment. It was also a lot of expectations on interactive media. So 60% expect that things like interactive music concerts, which are already existing, by the way, on these platforms, and events in VR will be mainstream within the next 3 years. So that was the perspective. And of course, then if we looked at different kinds of, so here's some of the numbers behind that. I won't go through all of these details maybe, but again, you can find this report on the net if you're interested in the details. Another area that I thought it would be interesting to pick up here is actually work. Because this is an area that's so now I'm not going to talk about research. I'm going to talk about myself instead. You're not supposed to do that if you're a good consumer researcher, but I will do that anyway. So actually VR will then of course change work for me. What we could traditionally do, if we do the most simple type of qualitative research, is that we invite people to what's called a focus group. I'm sure many of you have actually been invited in some, at least I have been that as a normal person, invited to focus groups myself. I was over here just on the Bashuset down here and talked about security solutions with Verisure, for example. They just invited me for that. Maybe some of you have had those experiences. So you sit down and you discuss a topic. One of the challenges with that is that you have to travel to the city where this is happening, and even though you might thought 51 million people were few, and you thought there were many, of course, if I had to travel to all these cities to do this sort of qualitative research, then I think it's many as well, because there's all these cities I have to go to. So that's a pain, of course, and of course, once you go there, in some countries everyone appears on time. But sometimes you go to a city and actually half of the group doesn't show up because they forgot about it, or there was a traffic jam or some other reason. So having people coming to the central facility itself is kind of messy in some cases. So we thought, okay, let's try to do this most simplest thing inside of VR instead. And so we tried to recreate this sort of room. We didn't have a table, so we had a chessboard instead, but we did have sort of the whiteboard here, and this is actually a picture from the sort of the concepts and the discussions we had there, where we could then sort of discuss. And these were then participants in the group interview, and the moderator, you can't see her because you see this from her eyes. That's me, by the way, if you wonder. So I was an observer in this. And so you can have moderators and participants anywhere. I was sitting in Malmo when I was there. The moderator was sitting in Bangalore in India. And these people in the room, they were mainly in this session, I think they were all actually in the US, but we also had participants from Canada and the UK. And of course, observers, normally you have this sort of, I don't know if you've been to one of these focus groups, you see this sort of big mirror on the wall. And you go, oh, nice, I can look myself in the mirror, but actually there's a lot of people standing behind there watching you, so it feels a bit strange. Here you can just watch this on a PC instead. And actually what we also saw was that even though this looks fairly different from this, a lot of the body language, a lot of the sort of these kinds of things in a way translate into VR. So actually you do get a variety of personal expressions, body language, different avatars, and so on and so forth. And of course, this becomes then quite cost and time efficient. But there were also some challenges. For example, all of a sudden people disappeared. When I talked about this Verisure, that was interesting to be part of, but I thought the topic wasn't actually so interesting. But it was difficult to just stand up and leave in the middle of everything. In a virtual room, people say, I don't like this discussion, and they're gone. We also had some people trolling the moderator. The moderator was a woman. Many of the participants here were men, and they started being nasty to her in some of these groups. And that was another challenge that you wouldn't find in a physical environment. So even though this is kind of trying to recreate the real space, there were some very striking similarities and some very striking differences. But I'll give you just one short clip of how this sort of discussion went. It's a very short one, but let's see if we can play it here for you.
Yeah, they're tracking, or they're like skinning on their models a little bit off.
So the interesting thing with this one was actually the same as you can find in a traditional focus group setting. What actually is very interesting is when people start becoming interested in each other. So rather than a moderator trying to ask you questions about things, people start asking each other, what are you doing? Why are you here? What's your interest in this? Or what are you doing? And they start discussing. And this was actually a short clip of what was happening here. So this guy here, he had a full bodysuit. So he didn't just have a head like some people, or a head and hands. He had a full body inside of VR. And people asked him, oh, can't you show us some cool moves? And can you dance around? And then he said, well, actually, what I can do as well is that I can show you what I call the monster, because I found a glitch in the system. And when I bow over like this, I become, I start looking like a monster. So if you look at him once again here, the monster. So you see his head, his neck becomes.
Yeah, they're tracking, or they're like skinning on their models a little bit off.
So all of a sudden, even though no one was in this room, there was a real room social dynamic in this case. And the results from this study was quite interesting. So in that sense, my work as a consumer researcher will definitely change with these technologies. Another area that will also change, or two other areas, are then education and tourism. And people were expecting all of this to then move into VR. VR will transform education and learning, said a lot of these people, more than 60%. And again, those who were just sort of interested in this area, they were lower on the scale. But interestingly enough, those who were laggards, they were aware of VR, what that meant, but they had no intention of becoming involved themselves. They were actually, a quarter of them believed that other people would use this a lot, and specifically then, for example, VR training in medicine and in surgery and so on. If you think about surgery, I'd be scared if they all of a sudden, didn't realize that they were not in VR and I was the patient there, but never mind. Tourism was, of course, then another area. And I think what's interesting here is not only the fact that people thought that they would be exploring information using these AR-enabled apps that we're actually seeing to come out now with these new platforms for the mobile operating systems, where you can have arrows in the street and you can have information overlays on things in the actual world around you. But a quarter also believed that they would be, so traveling is not just about exploring places, it's actually going somewhere with other people. And this social dimension was something that a quarter were expecting to be happening within a year. So already today, for example, if you're using Google Earth in VR, you can travel the whole world. I used to live in Japan for many years, for example, more than 10 years of my life. And one of the things I did when I first tried Google Earth in VR is that I traveled to this little city that I used to live in, Tsukuba, to see my house that I used to live in. Unfortunately, it had been torn down. It wasn't there anymore. So it was kind of a strange experience to walk around in the city to find that my house was no longer there. But I was doing that alone. Now, the expectation is that we will be doing that kind of travel together with other people. So the social dimension is very strong. So those were some examples of how these different areas are expected to change. Of course, this is not going to be just sort of happy days and happen just like that. There are many challenges if this is really going to happen. And on the most simplistic level, of course, there are lots of sort of challenges that people have experienced with the current generation of technology out there. So again, here we're comparing early adopters, those who plan to use a headset, and those who are saying, I know what this is about, but I'm not interested in this. And as you can see, those who are planning, they haven't started yet because of the cost. But there are other things that people agree on. For example, this is heavy and clumsy in different ways. It heats up. For example, when we did qualitative research, when we had this sort of virtual room, people who were using Samsung Gear VR, which is the headset for Samsung smartphones, they would suddenly overheat and disappear for that reason. They would come back and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to leave the room, but and poof, and then they were gone again because it was still overheating. It's uncomfortable, Content is limited to gaming and I mean, the first time you see a zombie in VR is really great, but the 150th time you see that zombie is kind of boring. So it's limited content and so on and so forth. Of course, we all kind of recognize these kinds of barriers from any kind of new technology, so this is not so surprising. What I think is a bit more interesting, though, is that we are actually facing some, let's say, challenges and hurdles of a different nature with this that we call then mixed reality paradoxes. Now, not merged reality, because once you have a merged reality experience, that's when the paradox is gone. You are not really thinking about if this is physical reality or some other kind of technology, augmented reality. But when you're mixing oil and water, for example, what happens is that they don't merge. As soon as you stop stirring, oil and water separate out again. And that creates a feeling of paradox for you, this mixing but not merging. The first one, then, obviously, is the paradox of mobility itself. So I mentioned Google Earth. It's a fantastic feeling of freedom. You can go anywhere on Earth. You can fly across New York and say, oh, there's Trump Tower, and whatever you want to see in New York. But physically, you can't go anywhere with it. A, maybe it's connected with a cable, and B, you won't see anything, so you just walk into whatever's in your way. So that creates a strange feeling of inconsistency among people. The second one we call the paradox of isolation. So, as I mentioned, people were expecting to, for example, travel together in VR. So the social dimension in many of these areas was very important for people. And you can, as you saw in this room, or maybe I didn't in this short clip manage to convey the feeling that we were actually in this room together in the interview, but in reality, that's the feeling I had. I can promise you, it was just like being in a room with people. And we were worlds apart physically. So you can do that, but at the same time, someone who's next to you is not part of that at all, because you're totally blocking that person off. So that also creates a feeling of strangeness for users. The final paradox is also related to social, and that's the social paradox of integration. Now, this one is a bit different, because what we saw with these early adopters, and maybe this sort of a bit platitudinal in the sense that early adopters are supposed to be a bit nerdy and maybe not so socially oriented. These people were extremely socially, they had very high expectations of VR becoming a social platform for them. But they actually also committed that they didn't have much of a social life in the physical world today. So this is the social paradox of integration. And what we said was that, well, this means that all of these platforms now that are trying to do social VR, they will have real, if they actually manage to cater to the early adopter market, it will be difficult for them to actually translate that into mass market. The platform we used for the research is a platform called AltSpace VR. And this summer, they announced that they're going to close the doors because they couldn't get risk capital funding anymore. So we said, okay, yeah, that's what we thought. These early attempts at social VR platforms are actually going to fail. But hey, last week, Microsoft bought them. So maybe they will actually be successful in the end. But these paradoxes are something that are a bit more difficult. You can't solve this with just a lighter headset or more battery or whatever. I've talked a lot about VR, and maybe some of you expect a bit more AR. So let's talk a little bit AR as well, because even though I said that most of the people here were then more focused on their experiences with VR, actually, even though that was the case, most of the people, or let's say half of the people roughly at least, they said that actually AR is the main platform for the near term. And that will actually integrate with VR. So you will have an AR platform that then lets you do VR as well. So for example, people were saying, well, first of all, it will have more real-world applications because it's easier to integrate that with the physical environment, of course, and it will be more mainstream and so on. But AR and VR will eventually be integrated into one common device is an important aspect. So consumers were saying, well, maybe this is doable or not doable. I don't care, but this is going to happen because that will solve some of the issues I have. For example, if I feel this sort of locked out perspective, well then if I have a slider or something, then I can see you again. So we are actually socializing both here and inside of this virtual world. So this was a quantitative result from this type of a quote that we then did in some of the focus groups. We also did traditional focus groups, by the way. So this particular person was not in VR. We did because we didn't have a Japanese-speaking moderator for this project who was also comfortable with VR. But anyway, eventually VR and AR hardware will merge, and you will be able to do both from a single device. That's how you pick up ideas from Qual, and you then quantify that in a survey, so to speak. So, finally then, I would also like to say something about why we in Ericsson think this is also an interesting industry to watch, because Ericsson doesn't do VR and AR glasses and these kinds of things, but there were actually also already in the qualitative survey we did a lot of unprompted ideas about how 5G would help people out. So we tried to quantify some of this, and roughly then you can see that a third or so of the respondents in the quantitative phase, they also had concrete expectations on the next generation mobile networks that will then come after 4G, which is what you have in your phones today. And that would be relating to mobility, stability, high capacity kinds of things, because of course also in this quantitative phase, even though there were 51 million people, they were still relatively advanced people, so they have ideas about technology, so to speak. This will also be needed to improve your resolution, and actually, for example, battery was an issue. So some people were saying that maybe the transmission of data here is not optimized, and that will also be needed in next generation networks. Lag was a big problem. A lot of people talk about having, seamen used to talk about having sea legs. And if you've been on a boat for a long time, you notice when you get off the boat, the actual Earth starts feeling like that. So in VR, people talk about their VR legs instead. But also, of course, making this more accessible through new, better data plans and so on and so forth. Of course, some of this can probably be done with other technologies as well, but I think we will see a lot of focus on next generation networks of different kinds of technologies due to the fact that these kinds of expectations will probably grow as we go forward. And just to sum things up here then, some of the key findings from this study we did here, 7 out of 10 early adopters expect VR and AR to change in these 6 areas we talked about: media, education, work. I didn't talk so much about social interaction here, but you heard me talking about this idea then of this paradox of social isolation. So there were lots of expectations around the social dimension. Travel, and we didn't talk about retail. Actually, in our research project, the expectations on retail were much higher on the Asian side than on the, let's say, Western side. So people in Japan and Korea and China, in that area, we see more of expectations that AR and VR will be used for shopping kind of purposes, even though that was also present in other parts, but it was much more pronounced in Asia. Media is actually already happening to media. I think that's quite interesting due to the fact that that's how internet itself evolved, and virtual screens will not totally replace, but they will start sort of taking a space where TVs used to be. Yes?
One question about retail.
Yeah.
So if you replace the wall,
yeah.
what do you buy? Because I mean, if you will go to
yeah.
retail, I will buy
So for example, if we look at the qualitative research, people were saying things like, I buy stuff online, but it's very difficult to know what it actually looks in reality. So if I could do it in VR and actually see the product, I could turn it around and look from all the angles and so on. So that could be one example. Yes. And there were also expectations around AR, which were more than kind of this sort of markup. So, sometimes I can't find on the tag, I'm looking for some specific piece of information. It's not on the tag, and it's these shop assistants are not available, or they just want to talk sales or something. So if I could have you look at that in an AR application and get more information, for example, when I'm actually physically shopping. So there were a range of different kinds of ideas about how VR as well as AR would actually improve the shopping experience. But those, in an unprompted situation, those were much more vocal on the Asian side of the study. Yeah. We also talked about challenges here, then lack of mobility, bulky headset, and network lag. And of course then these sort of, I would say, even more interesting paradoxes that people are feeling that are a bit more difficult to solve. But I think those are the really interesting challenges, and people who will solve those, I think those are going to be the people who do really, really successful work in VR and AR. And 5G will probably be part of the solution for some of these things going forward in order for this to be mainstream. Because, for example, people were saying about the current generation of advanced headsets, I have cables sticking out of my head. It doesn't feel nice. So mobility is something that everyone expected to be there going forward. Of course, again, we have this issue with moving and not seeing around you. So it's related to the paradox as well, of course. But also, social experiences would probably need to have less lag, and also this discussion about nausea that I didn't have time to go in depth about here. We did a lot more work in that field, and that's also an area where people see next generation networks becoming an important part of the solving these problems. So that was my little presentation about merged reality. Thank you.